A lot of fun. Anyway, we're very fortunate today to have Gregory Cohen. He's an associate professor of neuromorphic systems at Western Sydney University and the program lead of neuromorphic algorithms and space applications. He's a pioneer of an event-based and neuromorphic sensing for space image applications, unsupervised feature extraction, bio-inspired machine learning, and neuromorphic computing systems. He holds a BS and MS from the University of Cape Town in South Africa and a joint PhD from Western Sydney University and the University of Pierre and Marie Curie. Please welcome Greg.
All right, everything okay? So, good morning, everyone. I'm Greg Cohen. I'm from the Western Sydney University of Australia, and I'm going to talk to you today about two very different things. I'm going to talk to you somehow about robotic foosball and space imaging with event-based cameras. So, I'm from the Western Sydney University, which is in sunny Australia, and I'm from the International Centre for Neuromorphic Systems, which is something the university set up earlier this year to sort of invest more in the idea of neuromorphic engineering. And we kind of break it down into three main categories. There's neuromorphic perception, which is the idea of building sensors that work in a more biologically inspired way. We do neuromorphic computation, which is looking at how to process this data in a neuromorphic and biologically inspired way without having to go back to frames and conventional ways of doing it. And then the algorithms that tie it all together. So I'm going to talk a lot about applications, because it's really the applications that drive the algorithms. And we feel like the algorithms then drive the hardware and the sensing you need to use. So it may seem like two very different topics, foosball and space, but I'm going to find a way to link them together through this idea of active sensing. So that's why my talk's called Active Sensing and its applications to space imaging. So part of this comes down to the way these cameras that I'm going to talk about today work. And you'll see that both problems involve this idea of having motion either of the camera or of the scene. So I should also say that the International Centre for Neuromorphic Systems is growing fast, so if anything in this talk interests you, we're looking for postdocs, PhDs, technical officers, even visiting fellows. So please come speak to me afterwards and see what we can set up for you. So I think what I'm going to do is, just before I get into my talk, I'm going to go through a few interesting points that I'm going to refer to as I talk. And I'm going to come back to these again and again, so I thought I'd just get them out of the way early. The first one is this idea of active sensing. And the real idea here is the cameras I'm using, these event-based neuromorphic cameras, they don't produce frames, they produce streams of events. And that is to do things you can't do with a normal camera, like image whilst you move the sensor. And this is the idea of active sensing. It's kind of what we do when you're trying to read something far away and you can't quite make it out. What you do is you move your head a little bit. You're trying to actively change the way you're sensing to extract more information from the scene. You do this as well when you can't hear someone. You sort of cup your ear and move your head. What you're doing is you're changing the way you're sensing to try to get more information. Now we can do that with event-based cameras too. And it turns out that if you know how you're moving the camera, you can actually extract far more information out of the scene. And I'll show you how that applies both in foosball and in space imaging applications. And that kind of ties into the second point on the slide, which is this idea of expectation and prediction in neuromorphic systems. So imagine if you have a little network, and its job is to predict the next input it's going to see. You don't actually care about what that network is predicting some of the time. You care about the difference between what you predicted and what you actually see. Because if you can predict exactly what you're going to see, your model of the world is correct and you don't actually have to do anything. It's when you see something you don't expect to see, or conversely, and just as important, if you don't see something you expected to see, then you have to do something. That's your novelty signal that says, hold on, my model of the world isn't coherent with what I'm seeing and I have to do something. And that's kind of how the cameras I'm going to talk about today work. They only report changes. So when nothing's happening, you get no data out. And these systems are interesting because you can stack them. And the idea is that when nothing is happening, you don't have to do anything. And if you build your processing and your sensing in that sort of paradigm, when nothing is happening, you don't do any processing either, and you don't have to waste any power. It's exactly the opposite of the way conventional cameras work, where you're essentially pulling frames out of the camera and then searching for features or whatever you're doing with them, and then decide that you don't have to do anything. The idea is to try to get down to the sort of power efficiency, the robustness, and the reliability of biological systems. So I touched a little bit on that third point here, which is that you can use the temporal resolution of these sensors to make up for the spatial resolution. The cameras I'm going to talk about today have a very, very high temporal resolution. And if you know how you're moving them, you can actually get sub-pixel accuracy in the direction of motion. So you can trade off between the two. So there's this trend towards building bigger and bigger or higher and higher resolution sensors. And I think for event-based sensing and biological devices, you don't necessarily need that. You might have a foveated approach, much like how our eye works, with a few very high, or a small area of high density pixels and a larger peripheral vision, and you move that around actively to see what's going on. The fourth point on the slide, the importance of synchronization, is quite a subtle point, but these cameras report changes, and what we can do, well, how the standard cameras work, are that they tend to give these changes a timestamp when they occur. And usually you just give them a relative timestamp, in microseconds in this case. But what we can do is we can give it an actual timestamp from a source like GPS or a high accuracy clock. And that lets us do something really interesting. We can give every single change from every single pixel in every single camera, regardless of where it is, an absolute timestamp, down to the microsecond level quite happily. And that's just of GPS, for example. Now, for space applications, that means we can put telescopes all around Australia, pointed at the sky, and know they're all synchronized. In fact, the only latency is trying to get them to a central point where you can process them together. And that lets us do things like ranging really easily. With these cameras, because you're using time, problems like stereo matching just become coincidence detection. If something happens in the scene, like a simple, let's say you only have a star moving, or a satellite in our case, and you catch them in both cameras, you can assume that events happening at the same time are from the same source. And then the difference in the location of the sensor fields of view, that's your disparity matching. So you can get away with using the hardware and the way the data is produced to get around a lot of hard computation otherwise. Probably the most important point on the slide is the second last one. Everything I'm going to talk about today is biologically inspired, not biologically false. I'm not saying this is how biology works, and I'm certainly not going to let how biology does it. I'm not going to make concessions to how biology does it in terms of how I build my algorithms and systems. Simply put, I want to build the best star tracking system I can, or the best satellite tracking system I can, and I'm looking to biology for inspiration. So I'm quite happy to make concessions here, but it's all biologically inspired at the end of the day. And finally, everything we talk about today, I'm going to talk primarily about systems that are on the ground and plugged into the walls, as telescopes, for example, and the robotic foosball table. So they're not particularly power-sensitive applications, but keep in mind that everything we talk about was always designed to be low power and low bandwidth, both in the sensing side and the computing side. And that's important because if you want to start putting these cameras and these systems on CubeSats, for example, or micro-aerial vehicles, every bit of power you waste running the camera or running the processing is less flying time or less operational time in terms of a satellite. And when I say low bandwidth, I don't necessarily mean low data rate, but I mean high information content. You're only sending the relevant information. And the trick is that it comes out in this event-based, continuous way. And the last thing you want to do is make frames out of it. Because the moment you make a frame out of it, you might as well use a standard camera. What you want to do is do the processing in the same paradigm. You want to make the processing event-based so that when your camera's not producing any data, you're not burning any power doing the processing for it. And the argument I'm going to make is that I think cameras are the wrong tool to do tasks. Cameras are designed, if you think about them at the end of the day, they haven't really changed much since the first camera obscura. They're there to capture a representation of a scene, primarily to fool the human eye into seeing what was there. If you take a glass, for example, on the table and look at it, we don't know what your brain is taking from that image to do that object segmentation and classification. We just grab everything in the hope that there's enough there to fool your brain. Right? And, all we do is just make it higher resolution, faster frame rates. We just grab more and more and more. And the information is there, but we're really capturing everything. So I call that sensing to measure to some degree. But if you want to do tasks, that's not what you want to do. You want to only grab the relevant information to the task you're doing. So you only want to essentially sense to perceive. So that's what biology does. We can't see infrared because we don't need to from a biologically evolutionary point of view. You can make the argument that kangaroos in Australia keep getting hit by cars because they never had to evolve to see large, fast-moving objects. Simply put, biology only sees what it needs to see. And if we want to try and get to the sort of efficiency of biology in terms of sensing computation, we should only take from the scene what we need to do that task. For satellite tracking, we don't want high-resolution images of the sky. We want X, Y, Z, and velocity. But at the end of the day, we're producing far too much information, and that causes a problem in terms of the processing and the handling, the storage, the transmission of that data. So I'm going to quickly introduce these cameras. They have a bunch of names. Everyone calls them something different. They're silicon retinas, they're event-based cameras, they're Davis sensors, dynamic vision sensors, but essentially what they are is a biologically inspired sensor with a photodiode, where the photoreceptor has additional circuitry so that it only reports changes. So each pixel in this camera is asynchronous and independent of its neighbors. And they only report changes in log illumination. So you get this really high dynamic range. And each pixel essentially sits at its own set point and looks for changes around that, which means you can have very bright parts of the scene and very dark parts of the scene. They don't interact with each other. Now, as a result of that, you don't have frames, you don't have exposure times, you don't have saturation effects, and you don't have motion blur. The output of the camera is a stream of special temporal events, and it's reacting to change. So take one of these cameras, point it at a static scene, and you get no data out the camera. Only when something moves in the field of view do those affected pixels send you information. And when you get that information, the pixels will tell you exactly where the change is occurring. So you can start tracking within microseconds of seeing something. So that's the great side of it. The problem, however, is that it's not frame-based. So computer vision algorithms don't work anymore. And the moment you take this data and you make a frame out of it, and you'll find in the literature for web-based cameras, everyone goes out of their way to call it anything but a frame. Baskets of events, buckets of events, sliding windows. But the point is, the moment you make a frame out of it and you get out of this event-based paradigm, you're probably better off using a conventional camera anyway. So we have to start again from the beginning and build all these building blocks. If you start with the application at the end, you can start figuring out exactly what you need all the way to the sensor level. And the idea is always to build algorithms and systems and move them closer and closer to the silicon until we can produce one day an actual piece of silicon. For example, for space imaging, where the processing is on board right behind the photodiodes, much like how your retina starts processing long before it gets to the visual cortex at the back of your brain. And then the camera only produces the relevant information. And that is what you transmit down. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting there. So I'm going to show you in a second some data from these cameras, some examples. And I'm going to do exactly what I told you not to do, which is make frames out of them, because that's the only way to show them in a video. So keep in mind that I'm throwing away a lot of temporal resolution by making these videos, but they still illustrate various points of these cameras. So the first video was actually shot in Telluride, Colorado a few years ago with a colleague of mine. We put one of these cameras on a little micro-aerial vehicle and we're flying it around the town park. And what you'll see here is frames at about 20 milliseconds. So each frame contains 20 milliseconds of data from a camera, and I have to compress the events into a frame. And when you have 20 milliseconds of events and you have microsecond resolution, that's quite a bit of information. And what you'll see is a gray pixel means there was no change in the last 20 milliseconds. A white pixel means the light intensity of that pixel increased, and a black pixel means the light intensity decreased. So this is the view from an event-based camera on a little drone flying around in Telluride, Colorado. You can see my colleague and I standing. In fact, that's Garrick Orchard, who now works at Intel. We're waving at the camera, but you might notice in the top left of the image the sun. The camera's staring directly into the sun. You can even see our shadows on the ground. And what happens is the pixels look in the sun saturated because it's really bright. But the rest of the world, because the pixels are independent of each other, they see the world that the sun isn't there. And you get this high dynamic range and this ability to image across these wide range of lighting conditions. In a second, it's going to cut to panning across some trees. And I'm always struck by the depth of field you can see there. You can really see the structure of the forest. And this is a 304 by 240 pixel sensor. And the reason you can see so much depth in this, it's almost 3D, is because we don't have motion blur. Although we're making frames at a constant frame rate, we're getting the data in between them so we can smoothly move backwards and forwards. This last bit is just simulating high optical flow. So at the bottom half of the image here is moving really fast, but the top half is stationary. You can actually segment on the event rate and deal with them separately. You can say, well, the bottom part I can use to figure out how fast I'm moving, whilst the top I can actually see where I'm going. And that turns out to be really easy when you start looking at the event rate from the camera. So now I'm going to switch the problem around. Instead of having the camera on the drone, I'm going to have the camera on the ground looking up at the drone. So this was shot in Sardinia last year with a couple of people, including from INI and from MITRE. There's the camera on the ground. That's actually Toby Delbrook lying there, who's one of the guys who invented these cameras. And we're looking up at a drone flying around. Now you can take the same data from these cameras and make frames at whatever frame rate you want. So I just render them at 25 frames a second, but I can take the same data and render whatever frame rate I want quite happily. So here's a drone. Again, we have the sun in the field of view. On the right is just an integrating surface to make it look a bit clearer so you can see things. And what you can see is that, again, we're largely unaffected by the sun. We can see the drone just fine. But we can take that same data and render whatever frame rate we want. Here it's at 3,000 frames per second. Now you can see the rotor spinning pretty clearly. But of course, we have microsecond resolution, so we don't have to stop there. We can quite happily take this down to 10,000 frames per second. Now, not only can you see the rotor spinning, but we can actually tell how the drone's about to move by looking at which ones are slowing down and which ones are speeding up. So this is the same data, just rendered at different frame rates. Now, the next part of this video blows me away every time I see it. The hot summer's day in Sardinia, there were insects all over the place, and watch this one little insect over here, flying around over there, and he flies directly through the sun twice. And yeah, when you change the paradigm which you do imaging, things like this happen. You see occlusions just as well as you see things getting brighter. So we don't lose the object as it flies directly through the sun. So this is quite exciting and quite unexpected for us. There were lots of other insects flying around as well. So I'm going to show you one more demo, one more set of examples that I think really illustrate some of the other benefits of event-based cameras. So a few years ago, we were asked to do a demo for the Australian Air Force to get them excited about event-based vision. And we came up with all these brilliant ideas. We're going to write numbers on ping pong balls and throw it across the camera. And someone said, no. The Australian Air Force, yeah, don't be soft. Drop model planes. They'll get that. And we did. So we took these little model planes. They're about 10 centimeters big, painted them uniform gray so they have no texture on them, and dropped them freehand in front of a camera on the table into a box on the floor. We dropped them about 800 times, so we got a bit tired of it in the end. But the interesting thing about that is because it was freehand, there's lots of variation. You know, we tried to do from the same height and at the same angle, but obviously there's an enormous amount of variation in that. And that's part of what makes this problem interesting. It's a real-world problem in that there's no controls here over a variety of lighting conditions, and it's a task that's essentially high speed. You have about 8 milliseconds in which the plane is passing through the field of view, or I think between 8 and 20, depending on how it goes. And you want to build an end-to-end event-based system, so both the sensing and the processing, to figure out which plane that is as it passes in front of the camera. And I'll show you how that works. I won't talk too much about the processing, but keep in mind the processing is also done in an event-based way. So when nothing is happening, you get no data out the camera, and you don't run these algorithms. This is what the data looks like. On the left is a conventional camera, so on my right, and your left, is a normal camera. On the other side is the event-based output. We can render it at whatever frame rate we want, and we use a relatively high-speed camera, 240 frames a second, and you can see that does a pretty good job. But with the event-based data, we can render it at whatever frame rate we want. So here is at almost 2,000 frames a second, and you can see how smooth it is on the event-based camera, and you can see what happens with the high-speed camera when you try to look at it at that frame rate. But where it gets really interesting is when you start looking at the data rate between those two cameras. This is a comparison of the data rate from the normal camera, the top left, the event-based data on the bottom, and a graph of the total data produced on a logarithmic axis. There's two things to note here. Firstly, the orange line, which is the conventional video, is orders of magnitude more data. It's about 600 megabytes versus 60 kilobytes of data. And I grant you that I'm actually looking at the uncompressed amount of data from the 240 frames a second camera. But you may think that's unfair, but because you can compress it down, but ultimately if you're processing that information, you have to uncompress it. So that's the amount of data you have to deal with a sensor like this. For the event-based camera, not only is it less data, there's something else really important about it as well, which is that you get saliency for free. Notice on the blue line that it jumps up the moment the plane enters the field of view. You simply know something's happened because there's this jump in the event rate. So it tells you there's something to do, right? Both in terms of the fact that you're getting more events and those events respond to what's happening in the scene. So people sometimes say to me, but surely the top image is better, the normal video. You've got color and you've got far more pixels. There's more information there. And I totally agree with you. And in fact, I see event-based vision and conventional vision as complementary. Right? The trick, though, is that if I can do the task with the event-based data at 660 kilobytes versus 600 megabytes, that's far better in terms of there's just less data to process, to transmit, to store. Right? And not only can I do it with that data, I can do it better. And I'll tell you why. So with a normal video, we have to use conventional computer vision techniques to do that classification. We have to look for features. And for 2D images, we kind of know what good features are. They're edges, they're corners, they're blobs. They're things that we can track. So we pull frames out the camera, we search through them for these features, we track how those features work, and we do some sort of classification on top of it. With the event-based camera, we change things around a bit. Firstly, we only look for the features when there's data coming from the camera, so most of the time we're doing nothing. And what we're looking for there aren't 2D features. They're actually a bit more subtle. They're these sort of spatial temporal features that have time as an aspect as well. So we're not just looking for the shape, but how that shape moves through the space. And those are really specific. So often we can tell which plane it is just when we see the nose cone. And as it moves down the field of view, we get more and more certain of which plane it is. And usually we're 99% certain by the time it's a third of the way through the field of view. Another interesting part of this, we used to do this as a live demo. But unfortunately, after dropping planes enough time, they break and we couldn't find replacements. But the trick is that you can actually stand in the frame while you drop the plane, and it doesn't affect the algorithm because you don't move in a plane-like way. And the feature extraction method we use here is unsupervised. So if you train it just on planes and you're in the field of view, it ignores you. If you wanted to pick up silhouettes as well, you just have to include yourself in the training data, and then it'll pick you up as well as class stuff. So you can find the features and the way of doing these processing. If you tailor it to the event-based camera, and the way this event-based paradigm works, you can get really, really exceptional results and still get that low power, low computation aspect. So I'm going to pivot slightly to robotic foosball. All right, and why it isn't as trivial as it sounds. So why did we build a robotic foosball table? What was the idea here? And it's interesting. So I've done a lot of work with data sets in my sort of research over the last few years. So I was part of the team that built the NMNIST data set, the Neuromorphic MNIST one. Gary Orchard and I were working together in Singapore on that. I've also put together something called eMNIST or MNIST, which is basically going back to the original NIST data set, which had letters as well as numbers, converting them all back down to look like MNIST digits. So I've had a lot of experience with data sets, and the reason is because it's interesting to see how do you benchmark, compare, and contrast algorithms, especially in the event-based domain. It's not that easy. How do we know if my algorithm is better than your algorithm? With neuromorphic, it adds other complexities, like we talk about power consumption. And there's no clear way to say whether my algorithm is better. What about learning? How adaptable is it to forgetting, for example? Or, use something like the Wisconsin test, where you switch the classes and see how long the algorithm takes to adapt. So why do we build a robotic foosball table? Because we wanted to provide a challenge problem. We said, well, all these data sets have one problem. Data sets are inherently static. And that's okay for conventional computer vision because everything is static. Even most of the learning algorithms, all the deep learning systems, they're essentially taking vectors, whether it's a flattened image or a vector of numbers. It's static shots of almost discrete inputs. The event-based camera gives you a much more continuous output. So you end up having to bunch them up, make discrete images, and feed them in. And the problem is the same with data sets. We have these discrete recordings. And if you want to look at something like active sensing, you can't actually make a data set to do that. Because the whole idea of active sensing is you want to do some sensing, look at what you're getting, and then move in response to what you're seeing. So if you want to see if that's an object you detect and and you can't quite make it out, you say, if I move left, and it is what I think it is, I would expect it to look like this when it moves right. You can't capture that in a data set, so you need a real-world challenge problem. And we spent a bit of time thinking about what to do here. And we picked robotic foosball for two reasons. Firstly, if you come to Telluride, you'll discover how much time we spend in the local bar playing foosball. And Mike Davies is surprisingly good at foosball, I might just add as well. So, I'm terrible at foosball, so I had to build a robot to even have a chance of competing with other people. But the reason is that it's actually a really good problem. It's relatively well constrained. You have a table where the balls will definitely be in. It's planar. You can always assume the ball's on the table. It's a relatively simple but high-speed task. You want to track this ball. And you have lots of distractors. It's a real-world task. At the end of the day, you've got the players moving, you've got all these unpredictable natures, and it's very clear to see who's winning, right? Ultimately, if your robot plays foosball better than my robot, it's a better foosball playing robot. So that's the idea of the benchmark at the end of the day. So this is what the table looks like. On the right-hand side here, it is assembled in Sydney, and then we shipped it over to Telluride and built it up there. Now, it's hard enough building a robotic foosball table, but building one that you can actually take apart, ship to another country, and reassemble, like I take my hat off to the guys in my lab who put this together. They've done some fantastic work here. And the idea was always to say, can we do this at a relatively low cost? There's nothing terribly expensive about this setup. We want to try and make it to the point that if someone wants to build their own foosball table, it's a few $100s at most. In fact, the table's about $100, and the equipment there is probably $200 or $300 on top of that. And how it works is it's pretty straightforward. So you're automating one half of the players. And players in foosball can move backwards and forwards, and they can rotate to kick. So the rotation is easy. You just put a motor on the end of the spindle, and you spin the players around, and they can kick. You need to move that backwards and forwards. So each row has a tray with a foot that the motor can slide backwards and forwards on. And we use this system with some string going across, attached to the middle to pull and push it. The reason we do that is that then attaches to a spindle, and you can see them at the bottom there, next to the motors, which means everything's rotation. And there are 8 motors to control the whole table, and all of them simply rotate. On top of that, we added a controller, so that you really have to do nothing but just say which motor you want to move and what position you want to move it to. And the reason was we want to get the latency and the controls as low as possible. They can move pretty fast. It's also pretty reliable in that regard. But there are some problems with it. In that string going across, you can see that in the camera, and you have to deal with that. It's a real-world problem. So I'll show you some data from what this camera looks like. What we did was we mounted the camera on that frame pointing straight down, so you have a bird's eye view of the table. We used a camera called the Davis 346, which has 346 by 260 pixels in it, but it also produces a slow frame-based output as well. And this is what the data looks like from the camera when you're just rolling the ball around. On the left are the events, on the right are the frames from the table. And what you'll notice is that the frames come out as constant frame rate, whereas the events from the ball are continuous. You get far more events from it. So it looks like a relatively easy problem to track that ball. And you can start to see why the event-based camera has some advantages when you really want to get that latency as low as you can. However, there are some other problems. You can see the bars. The bars that run across the table because they're reflective and people are moving around in the room. You can also see not just the person's hand, but you can see their shadow moving around on the table. So these are all things you have to deal with. So what you find is if you just take the ideal case of tracking a ball, that's easy. And anyone in the neuromorphic event-based vision community will tell you ball tracking is a solved problem, it's easy. But actually ask them to put their money where their mouth is and track a ball in a real-world task. That's a different story. So at Telluride this year, we had about 7 or 8 people trying to build ball trackers. Of those 7 or 8, let's say there were 7 of them, one was an analytical event-based algorithm. So it was entirely event-based. It works in the same way. It just operates an event, no data, nothing gets processed. But there was no learning involved. It was just essentially a continuous online half transform to look for circles. The other 6 methods were all based on deep learning and sort of spiky neural networks. The spiky neural networks ones actually work quite well. We just had a bit of integration issues trying to get them running fast enough and in real time connecting hardware together. In fact, one person actually implemented it in Luithi, and it looked pretty good. Just ran out of time to put it together. But the other methods, there were 2 things that came out of the deep learning methods in this problem. Firstly, they just weren't fast enough. And even if the network itself takes 5 milliseconds to process the data you put into it, you still have to collect the events, bunch them up, put them through the network, get something out of the network, which is used like a heat map, find the peak of that heat map and make a decision. In a game like foosball, you don't have time to do that. You have to really get the latency as low as possible because you don't really care about where the ball was. You really care about where the ball is. What you care about, prediction, where the ball will be. You can block it. So that's where the analytical method had its advantages. So what I'm going to show you now is some actual footage from people playing the table. Keep in mind that we built primarily a defensive strategy. We had a bit of trouble kicking, so only the front players kicked and not all that often. But it's pretty good for what it is. And this runs real time with an event-based algorithm using that camera. So this is the continuous half transform. This is just showing the sort of range of motion. This is calibrating and moving around. So you can see they can move quite quickly and fast. This is actually half speed. This is about halfway through the workshop. You can see things are starting to move in the right way. The red players are the ones being controlled by the computer, and kids love this thing, by the way. This is a bird's eye view towards the end of the workshop where things are getting a bit better. And you can see the players are actually responding. The right players are moving, and they're doing a pretty good job of getting in the way. Unfortunately, the human players are a little bit better. And you'll see perhaps the best addition to the table, which is completely not neuromorphic, when the guy scores. Someone in the workshop took it upon themselves to build a unique ball return system. So watch this. This is, by the way, how it tends to score most often. It just throws the ball into the other goal. But either way, this is actually at the end of the workshop. Now you'll see it's playing against a bunch of kids who stick their hands in and shake the table. And what you'll see here is that it does a pretty good job of blocking multiple times. So, we're getting there. The problem with the deep learning algorithms, the other thing I should have mentioned is that, remember yesterday we learned about what happens with a single pixel attack on a deep neural network? Well, you train on this data, but the table shakes. And imagine what happens when every pixel moves by 1 pixel to the left because someone is shaking the table or gripping it too hard, or just the motors are moving to the point that it shakes everything. And then you've got players kicking. There's so much variation that I don't think it's feasible to capture enough data to learn all of that, at least not in a realistic amount of time. And the point is that even if you do that, that analytical algorithm that just works straight off the bat, that might have some advantages there. So here, at this point, we're hoping to bring this table back next year. And if anyone's interested in fiddling with this and coming up with algorithms and ideas, that's something we really want to build a community around these sort of problems. I mean, we just implemented a good defense strategy here. It's pretty good at blocking. There's still an offensive strategy, so how do we get it to kick and how do we get it to figure out where it wants to place the ball? And then there are higher level strategies you can pile on top of that. So we're really excited about what we were able to achieve, which is essentially a closed loop real-time event-based control system here. that runs fast enough to play the game, but this is a good foundation on which to build new things. So that's the robotic foosball. I'm going to do an amazing segue to space situational awareness from this, which is also an Activision task. And I think it's probably best, I don't know if everyone knows what space situational awareness is and why you might want to use event-based cameras to track things like satellites. So I'll go through this pretty quickly. I kind of prefer the European Space Agency's definition of space situational awareness. They break it down into three things: space weather, near-Earth orbit objects, near-Earth objects, and objects in orbit around the Earth. Space weather is essentially just what's going on in the upper atmosphere. That's really important because it affects drag on satellites, and that's what makes orbital prediction difficult, especially for low Earth orbit. Near-Earth objects are less interesting to us. That's things like asteroids that might be coming towards Earth. They're important to look out for, but I don't think event-based sensors are necessarily the right tool for that. But it's the last one, tracking satellites, where event-based cameras have some really significant advantages. And that's what I've spent the last 2 years looking at. So why do we want to do this? Well, this is a simulation from the 1960s onwards of how many satellites we put up. Keep in mind the dots aren't to scale, but just gives you an idea of just how many things we put into space. And these are tracked objects. So they include active satellites, which there are about 2,000 of them. But there's about 24,000 pieces of space junk, about 10 centimeters or bigger. Some people, we haven't been very responsible about putting things in space. And when we launch things, often we leave bits of rockets that are still orbiting around, dead satellites, and then occasionally someone goes and blows up a satellite and creates a high velocity debris field. So some of these objects are moving incredibly fast. A paint ship in low Earth orbit can move at 700 kilometers an hour. If it hits something else, it's like a bullet. I think it was the windshield of the space shuttle was cracked by a piece of paint about 2 centimeters in size. And of course, this is becoming a pressing concern for, crewed spaceflight. In fact, they moved the International Space Station a few times a year to avoid large pieces of space junk. And I mean, if you think about it, everything we do is based on satellite technology now. We rely on GPS for everything. We rely on the communication satellites for almost every aspect of life, and we're doing a very, very poor job of figuring out what's going on there, and as well as regulating. In fact, there are very few laws that apply to space. And although that's something we need to fix, it's somewhat pointless to come up with laws until you can enforce them. And to enforce them, you have to know what's going on. That's kind of why there's a real interest in doing better, more distributed, lower cost space situational awareness. And the gold standard is radar. Radar can only pick up objects of a certain size or greater. And it's expensive. It costs millions of dollars to install one and millions of dollars to run. If you can get away with doing it with optical telescopes, they're smaller, they're cheaper, and you can put them in more places. But that's a difficult task, and that's where event-based cameras have their advantage. So I'm going to talk about a few orbital regimes. These are terms that I think I'll just go through very quickly so you'll know what I'm talking about in my later slides. The first part of orbit that you have to pay attention to is low Earth orbit. That's essentially a few thousand kilometers above the Earth's surface. It's the lowest orbit we can have. It's very attractive because it's easiest to get to. If you want to launch a spacecraft, it's easiest and you use the least fuel to put it into low Earth orbit. So in low Earth orbit, you'll find all sorts of things. You'll find the International Space Station is there, the Hubble telescope is there, and that's where we're putting all the CubeSats. And when you hear about these mega constellations of CubeSats and SpaceX and OneWeb want to put up, they want to put up in low Earth orbit. The problem is that the orbit times are pretty short. Sometimes these will go around the Earth every 90 minutes. And they're moving fast and they're hard to track from the ground. And it's getting pretty cluttered up there. So this is there's a lot of space up there. This is a problem we have to keep track of now. And tracking them and figuring out where they are is called space traffic management in the civilian world and space situational awareness in the more defense-related terms. Moving out from low Earth orbit, you get to what they call medium Earth orbit. Now, surprisingly, there aren't actually that many satellites out there by comparison. And that's because it's kind of the middle ground. It's much more expensive to get to than low Earth orbit. But it's also harder to put a satellite there because you have less atmosphere to protect you from radiation. So you need a bigger, hardened satellite. And the times it takes to orbit the Earth are slower as well. And that's where you'll find a lot of GPS satellites and navigation satellites, for example. But not as crowded as the next part of space, which is they're called geosynchronous orbit. So you'll see that enormous ring of satellites over there. And the reason that's so interesting is that geosynchronous orbit is about 32,760 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And it's the point at which the orbital time matches the Earth's rotation perfectly. So if you put a satellite up, it stays directly above that point and rotates with the Earth. And it's exactly where you want to put a communication satellite, a satellite TV satellite, anything like that. You want to put it in the geosynchronous orbit because it stays there. So as a result, everyone wants to put a satellite there, become extremely congested, And it's so far away that it's very hard to figure out what's going on. And there's some interesting things that happen up there that we aren't aware of. Sometimes satellites move that aren't supposed to move. I think about a year or 2 years ago, Telkomsat, which is an Indonesian satellite operator, one of the satellites was being observed by a company called Exoanalytic, and they have footage, you can find this on YouTube, of that satellite exploding. The whole chunk just blows off. And they called Telkomsat and said, hey, listen, what happened to your satellite? And I said, what do you mean? They didn't know. One of the hydrogen tanks exploded. And they were completely unaware of it because the satellite looked like it was operating normally. That is kind of terrifying given that we are so reliant on this part of space. So, how do we do space situational awareness with event-based cameras? Well, I think the best way is to show you some telescopes. So this is the first setup we started with. This is about 2 years ago in Adelaide with the Defence Science and Technology group from Australia. And they very kindly let us use their telescope setup. So we started with this 2 telescope setup you see on the left-hand side over there. It's on a robotic mount, so we can point accurately and we can track with it. And we have 2 telescopes wall-sighted, so they look at the same part of the sky. On the top one, you'll see there's that I think it's red, I'm not very good with colors. But it has this large camera at the back. That's a conventional astronomy camera, a finger-length instrument sensor. It's about $60,000 worth. It's a very, very impressive piece of kit. It's actively cooled. It has about a 2 megapixel resolution. It's built specifically for astronomy. It's amazingly sensitive. And that kind of represents a good gold standard in astronomy. On the bottom camera, on the blue telescope, you'll see an event-based camera hanging off the back there. Now that's a shoddy prototype camera, and I can attest to that because I put it together and you can even see the screws hanging out of it. The point is that whereas that is a refined camera, the event-based camera at the bottom is a prototype. This is baseline performance. We can only get better from this. These cameras weren't built for this at all. If you look at the middle pane, you'll see that the top telescope has this very sophisticated aperture, which is made of a cardboard box with a hole in it. And the reason we needed that was some of the objects at night, like Jupiter, for example, were so bright that to capture the event with the conventional sensor, we had to limit the aperture. The bottom camera with the event-based sensor on, because of the dynamic range of these cameras, we never had to change anything. Even the daytime imaging work I'm going to show you, done without changing the optics. Call it focus and forget. Probably trademark that. So then, we then eventually moved on to this 3 telescope setup you see on the right-hand side over here. Same mount, but now we've got the ground truth sensor in the middle, so we know exactly where we're pointing. We can build a pointing model. We can capture ground truth only at night, though. And on each side, we have 2 cameras on 2 different telescopes. And the reason we do this is because this gives us the ability to say what we're seeing is not specific to one camera and not specific to one telescope. It gives us an extra level of security to say, hey, listen, what we're seeing is real here. We've since moved on from this, and I shall show you our latest piece of kit. It's a mobile containerized SSA observatory in a shipping container. It has a sliding roof and a scissor lift, and some telescopes that rise up and do imaging. Ignore the sewer pump alarm sign. It's my fear in life that one day that thing will start flashing. I don't know if that means the sewer pump has failed or the sewer pump has kicked in and it keeps me up at night. But either way, the reason this is so interesting is that if you look at SSA observatories around the world, or any sort of astronomy, if you speak to an astronomer and you tell them that you want to build an observatory, the first thing they do is sink concrete into the ground and stabilize the platform. Because you want to have a stable platform to do space images. The interesting thing about event-based sensors is that you don't need that. Motion is good for us. Motion helps us. So whereas everyone else is trying to stabilize the telescopes, I don't mind some motion. In fact, it actually helps me more than anything else. So I can stick my telescope in a shipping container, dump it down somewhere, and start doing SSA. I don't have to stabilize the ground. In fact, I used to joke that whilst we're driving out to site with our telescopes, we can do SSA whilst we're driving, and the bumpier the road, the better our accuracy. Not entirely wrong. So what this gives us is the ability, unlike anyone else in the world, to move our observatories around. We can put SSA capabilities wherever we want because we're using the way the telescope works to do that. So this is this is our container at the Avalon Air Show, and the risk of embarrassing myself, we've given it a name. And if anyone here is a neuroscientist, you'll appreciate why neuroscientists do not like this. We call it the astrocyte. So astrocytes are that's probably not. So I'll give you a quick history about this thing because it's kind of an interesting story why we built it. Started off life at the end of last year as a sketch of my boarding class. I pitched it to the Air Force. I said, yeah, why not? Let's build it. Drew up some designs. They got a little bit more elaborate. And within 3 months, started fabricating the thing. And next thing you know, well, we make sure the telescope's fitted. So for someone who does space situational awareness, we have pretty poor spatial awareness. So we had to actually print 3D models to make sure everything fitted. And then next thing you know, we actually had this thing. And this thing spent 3 weeks out in the deserts of South Australia, actually doing an observation campaign. It was actually spectacularly successful. So it has a little air-conditioned office as well, so you can sit in there and work. And the idea is that eventually we'll shrink it down to a quarter shipping container and then deploy them wherever we need to. And our goal is to put a bunch of these around Australia and build an event-based SSA network. So let me show you what the data looks like from these sensors. This is the first recording I ever took with an event-based camera on a telescope. This is Mars. Right? Doesn't look like much, but you might notice it's bouncing up and down a bit. That's because we were really excited and jumping up and down next to the telescope. But you might also notice there's a cyclic pattern to it. And that I'll talk about in a bit as well. That's atmospheric scintillation. There's some really interesting things about this. You've got to understand that no one had ever looked at the sky through an event-based camera before, so we had no idea what to expect. And this was kind of like a monumental achievement. We actually saw something. Okay, that's pretty cool. And then later that night, we were just recording, nothing in particular, just running the camera. And all of a sudden, we saw this come through the field of view. Like, what was that? This was kind of the aha moment. We had this long argument about how it could be planes, but we were in controlled airspace, so it couldn't have been a plane. We thought it might be high-velocity moths, but that doesn't make sense, because why would they light up at night? And eventually, we came to the conclusion that it was a low Earth orbit satellite. And it turns out that we can see them really well with an event-based camera. So the next thing we did was go directly towards, we took the mount that can track, we downloaded the orbit of the satellite, and we followed it with the event-based, with the whole mount. So we had the camera pointing and following the satellite off a predetermined orbit. This is what it looks like from the normal conventional astronomy camera. You can see at the bottom left there, there's that bright splodge. Keep in mind you're integrating and stars are moving and you're moving, so when you take a photo, essentially, you get streaks for the stars. This FLIR sensor takes an image every 4 seconds or so. We get this update, and that's kind of what it looks like in the conventional sensor. I'll show you what the event-based camera caught whilst tracking that satellite. There on the left is what happens if you make a frame out of the data. On the right is what the data really looks like. It's a spatial temporal pattern, right? And a really rich one. So time is the vertical axis in this case. And that object is producing this event stream. If you see it's got a bit of kink at the bottom, that's because we jogged the telescope to make sure we can see it. What you're seeing flying through the field of view are stars. And that event stream actually contains a lot of information about the object we're tracking. For example, we can tell if it's tumbling because we can see this glinting effect, whether it disappears and reappears. And I think with a bit of processing and a bit of the adaptive optics work I'm going to talk about in a moment, we might actually be able to do far more characterization and resolving of that as well. So the idea is that if you look at it as a frame, you actually miss out on what the data really contains. And I at least think this is more interesting than the conventional image from the normal FLIR sensor. If we go to geosynchronous orbits, right, so this is low Earth orbit, we've got a problem there because, as I said, they're stationary relative to us and they're faint. And remember, I said if you take one of these cameras and point at the static scene, you get no data, right? So how do you see a geosynchronous satellite? Well, simple. It isn't moving, so you move. You actively sense it. So instead of pointing at it, you move past it. And you see it as it moves to the field of view. So on the right-hand side there on this visualization surface, you can see ABS-6, which is a geosynchronous satellite, coming through the field of view. It's clear as day. And that's particularly relevant because this was caught during the day. So we can see geosynchronous satellites, at least bright ones, during the day with these sensors, which is pretty exciting. And in this case, we're just moving in one direction. But if we went backwards and forwards, and we knew how we're moving, we could build high-resolution images of this. So this is what it looks like in the event-based camera. To show you what the conventional camera sees when you look at a geo, that's the dot in the middle there. That's the geosynchronous satellite. We're integrating while staring at it, so all the other stars that are moving become streaks, and that object stays resolved like that. I think my representation is a bit more interesting, to be honest. So let's go to perhaps my favorite video in this whole slide. This is daytime observation of LEO satellites. And what we're doing here is we're using 2 cameras simultaneously. The one camera on the left, one camera on the right. They're slightly different fields of view and different resolutions. And what you see in the middle there is there's a constant object being tracked. It has a star called Canopus. We keep in the field of view so we know where we're looking. And what you see passing into the field of view are satellites being tracked. At the bottom of the window, we're showing the tracks. We're actually taking those, tracking them in real time in hardware, and producing essentially position as it moves to the field of view. The reason I like this is that this is done at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in Adelaide, which is a very civilized time to do astronomy. If you're a lazy engineer like me and don't want to stay up all night, because you're building foosball tables at night, you do daytime astronomy. The other thing about it is that that data at the bottom is really what you care about. You don't want to send high-resolution images of the sky around. You don't even want to send the events from the camera. You want to send X, Y, Z, and velocity for each object you see. And if you can get down to that and you can get that algorithm into hardware, that's a tiny amount of data to transmit by whatever means you can. You can do that from a CubeSat. You can do that from a remote location. It gets around a lot of the problems and plays the strengths of these cameras. So I'll just move on from there to something interesting as well, which is how to do star mapping. What we did here was we pointed at a piece of the sky, just stared. And we said, well, if we stare, the stars will move through the field of view with the rotation of the Earth. And can we use it to actually build up a map of the stars we're seeing? So on the top left is the raw data from the camera. This is an old 240 by 180 pixel camera. Bottom left is this inference surface that basically says, well, I know the speed at which the Earth is rotating. So if I see a star, right, or what I think is a star, I know in a certain amount of time in the future I should see it over here because that's how much it would have moved with the rotation of the Earth. So take that and build up this inference model and then produce this long continuous star map you see on the right-hand side there. And the more we observe, the more certain we become about the stars we're seeing. So you see as the map gets longer, the stars get brighter and more defined. There's two interesting things about this. The first one is this is an entirely passive process. We could run this all night. We're not doing anything. We're literally just staring. And we're waiting for the Earth to rotate. But we don't have to do that. We can also actively move the sensor as long as we know the motion. So instead of just staring, we can move backwards and forwards in a known way. And while we're doing that, we can build up a high-resolution image of what we're looking at, while still catching fast-moving objects moving through our field of view, because the cameras can do that. You can just segment on the velocity, like I showed you at the beginning. So we took this image, and we lined it up with the ground truth sensor, and it actually worked really well. You can do the astrometry on this, and you can get a match. But the point is that little window I'm showing here, which is overlaid on the FLI image from the conventional astronomy camera, it's just a tiny part of a really long recording from that evening. So that's where we were about a year ago. We've improved on this a little bit. I'll show you the next video is tracking a satellite with the web-based camera. You'll see with the red circle. Now the interesting thing about tracking with a web-based camera, if you just use the web-based camera, tracking a single object is surprisingly easy because you're trying not to see it. If you're moving and you're tracking an object, you can't see the object, you're tracking it perfectly. If you're moving too slowly, you'll start seeing the one edge appear. If you move too fast, you'll see the other, and you know exactly how to correct for that. It's quite easy to follow an object, especially something simple like a point source, like a star. So whilst we're doing that, and that's the red circle you see in the top left there, we can see stars in the background. And we can use those stars to build this continuous star map. You see moving through the field of view over here. And we can use those stars to figure out exactly where we're pointing. So we can do continuous in-frame astrometry and figure out exactly where the telescope is pointed without using the mouse. And whilst we can track the object. So this is pretty interesting. This is all bringing it all together. There's a bit of magic under the hood that helps us track and keep track of what's going on and figure out what's stars and what's noise. But originally in that first example with the star mapping, we relied on the fact the Earth was rotating at a constant speed, and at that distance, that's essentially constant velocity across the sensor surface. We've been able to relax those constraints. We don't even need constant acceleration anymore. We can do non-uniform jerk. So essentially, you can jog the telescope, you can shake the telescope, and in fact, those are what those two insets are showing. That's the position of the satellite in the field of view, and it handles these enormous jumps when you sort of just move the telescope unexpectedly. And that's just because we can respond to the data really quickly and adjust. In this case, we're moving and the world is moving, but that's not a problem. We can take both into account. So the last, well, I'll go a little bit quickly through the adaptive optics side of things, but essentially this is a recording of Jupiter through two different web-based cameras at the same time, and I was very worried about this at the beginning because I didn't know what was going on. I thought there was vibration in my mount, and I'd spent all this money on it, so put accelerometers everywhere. Turns out if you spend a lot of money in the mount, it's dead stable. Then I came to the idea that maybe this was something else, and I actually went and asked someone. They said, oh, that's atmospheric scintillation. And this was interesting to us because we didn't know anything about it. And turns out there's this whole field of adaptive optics I learned about, and that adaptive optic sensors have these deformable mirrors, and they tend to run relatively slowly at a few hundred hertz for a high-end system. We're getting data from these cameras at essentially megahertz speeds, microsecond resolution, and that's even arbitrary. We can probably go faster. So the question is, can we do adaptive optics with this? And there's some compelling reasons why this might make a really good adaptive optic sensor. I'm going to show you a simulation in a second of what happens with atmospheric scintillation and noise on these cameras. The first, you're going to see two panes. One is with scintillation, one is without, and the first is going to be with no noise and then with noise. And the white circles show you where the stars are. No scintillation, no noise. You can see the stars. And what you'll see the scintillation as, it spreads that information from that ring on the outside to the center as well. So we see it a bit more clearly. That's nice, but when you add noise, so the sensor noise, watch what happens. You basically can't see the stars without scintillation. But with the scintillation, it spreads that information. Now you have structure moving through the fixed pattern noise, and that's much easier to pull out. So we can use scintillation to our advantage to help see things. But we can also, perhaps, we might even be fast enough to algorithmically walk back some of the atmospheric scintillation without having to do something like a deformable mirror and correct for us. We might even be able to have our cake and eat it. We might be able to use scintillation to see more, and then use that as well in computation and processing to remove some of this scintillation. Simultaneous to that, we're actually looking at just building adaptive optic systems with event-based cameras. So this is done with a colleague of mine at UNSW Canberra and funded by the AFOSR to look at atmospheric turbulence. We're building a Shack-Hartman sensor over here, which essentially leverages the fact that the event-based cameras have some of these really dynamic properties that make them fast in the high dynamic range. So we've got a setup there with a laser, creates a point source and a formal mirror so we can actually stimulate atmospheric scintillation and Davis 240C event-based camera pointed at it. And just to go over this really quickly, the benefit to this is that this is the frames from the event-based camera on the left and the event-based output on the right. And essentially, you've got a lenslet array, and you're tracking how the dots in each of those lenslets move, and that gives you an idea of how the turbulence works. The real take-home message from this is if you look at the event-based frames, it's a laser source, so the brightest part is the center. And if you use a conventional imager, that's the part that has the highest brightness, and your exposure essentially is dictated by that. The event-based sensor, you use the whole sensor because everything is independent. So the pixels on the edge simply are seeing a different set point to the ones in the center. So you get more information and you get it much, much faster. This is still early days. This is results from we presented in Munich 3 weeks ago. So this project is just kicking off, but there's some exciting results. I'm going to wrap up with one last little bit, which is seeing through clouds. This is a recording of the moon through an event-based camera. And what you can see is the clouds moving across the surface over here. On the left is the events, on the right is reconstructed grayscale. And the clouds are helping us. They're actually inducing change. They're moving through the scene. That was kind of interesting. But then we looked at this and thought, well, couldn't we separate those clouds from the moon? We know they're moving at different velocities. The moon is moving slowly. The clouds are moving fast. And we said, yeah, maybe we can. So we did. Top left is just the events from that camera. On the right-hand side of the clouds moving faster. We produce a nice map of the clouds moving. And the bottom left is the image of the moon forming in the background. So this is interesting, and it means we can do things like we can do some astronomy, we can do space situational awareness when it's slightly cloudy, which is also something that astronomers don't tend to like terribly much. And we looked at this and thought, well, can we use this somewhere else? And I like this as an example because it's a case of taking a constrained problem. Space is a fantastically constrained environment. Looking at the solution and taking that and applying it on another problem somewhere else. And I feel like this is exactly what we can do with the foosball table. Which say, solve the problem, come up with a solution on a constrained environment, and expand it to a real-world problem. So we took the seeing through the clouds. We said, well, can we see through bushes? We set up a camera on this translation table in the lab. We built this very sophisticated stick wall that you can see over there, which is kind of opaque. It's hard to see through. And we can move the camera backwards and forwards behind it. And it's kind of like walking past a picket fence. You can see through the gaps and make a guess on what's on the other side. In this case, there's lots of gaps in the sticks. And the camera, as it's moving, the pixels looking through the gaps see the world as if the sticks aren't there. And as long as you know how you're moving, you piece all those together, you can build up a really good representation of what's on the other side. So that's the scene we're trying to image. That's my colleague standing in our lab. We have some objects on the table, a bottle of wine, a cup. There's a traffic cone that's been in the lab forever. I don't quite know where that came from. But the idea is, can we move the camera and reconstruct that scene? Now, what we can use here is parallax. Because we know objects close to the camera will move less than objects far away. So if we create two velocity surfaces, or as many as we want. One can be a near field, and one can be a far field. And this is the results. This is with a normal camera first. And as you can see, you can't see terribly much. This is with the event-based camera. Top left is the raw data from the camera. Top right is trying to image the sticks, which doesn't work terribly well. But the bottom two are the really interesting ones. On the left is the near field. You can start seeing objects on the table quite clearly. And on the right is the far field. You can actually see the structure of the room as we're moving. This is much slower than real time. It's really pretty quick. And in fact, if we go backwards and forwards, we can build up a high resolution image of that because we can get sub-pixel resolution in the direction of motion. I reckon with enough passes, we could probably read the bottle label. I could tell you what vintage it is. But you can see this is reconstructed through sticks. So I think I'm just going to conclude with something that I think is just a little bit more of a way of thinking about all of this. I was asked earlier this year to talk about what I thought, what I thought space situational awareness would look like in 20 years' time. What's the emergent disruptive technologies for space situational awareness? What are the sensing problems going to be? And how we're going to solve in 20 years' time? And I'm worried about this because I thought, I had no idea. I would never have predicted where we are 20 years ago. So I kind of copped out. Instead of talking about what I thought space situational awareness was, I went to them and said, listen, guys, I don't know what's going to happen, but I know that biology has this sort of roadmap for sensors. And I thought maybe it would be an interesting way to say, let's take a look at how biology scales up sensors. Maybe we can see where we fit into this and how we work on that. So at any opportunity, I mention sponge larvae because I'm fascinated by these guys. What makes sponge larvae interesting is that they have no neurons. they essentially have a photoreceptor, but there's no processing going on. They respond to light, but that's really it. They're like a photodiode. But they don't move, they don't do terribly much, but they are photosensitive. That's kind of what I consider the base sensor. You go up in the order of complexity when it comes to eyes, and you get to the box jellyfish. Now they're interesting because they have about 24 eyes sometimes, of 4 different types. They're pretty complicated, and they have neurons at the eye, but no brain. There's not a whole lot going on inside of a jellyfish. But the point really is that they have some local processing at the sensor, and they can do a whole bunch more. They move around, they can move away from things and towards things. So they may not be thinking, but they're absolutely more capable and intelligent. They're a smarter sensor. You go up, you might have heard about the mantis shrimp. This is just a completely crazy animal in every way. One of the things that makes it unique is that we have 3 color receptors. These guys have 16. And some recent research has indicated that what might make them different from us is that whereas we have 3 color receptors, we mix those colors and have the spectrum of colors. It looks like the mantis shrimp doesn't. It has 16 color receptors, and it has 16 color channels, and it basically kills everything that's green and eats everything that's blue. It kills everything, I should say, if you know anything about this. But the idea is that it specialized the sensor to make the processing easier. And I think that's an interesting idea, saying if you build the sensor specifically for the task you want to do, you have to do this processing on the end. Things get a bit more interesting when you go and say, well, what if you scale it up? What about something like the honeybee? Kind of what we want from an autonomous sensing network, right? There's no central control in the colony. Each bee is low power. It's autonomous. They're UV sensitive as well, they can see UV light. But they go and together perform a complicated task without any central control. They're a system of systems. Right? That's kind of where we really want to get to with these sensing networks. We don't want to be making high-level decisions. We want them to be smart and intelligent on the sensor level. And finally, we define spatial awareness. So we're at the top of the whole idea, this idea that we define domain awareness, so mammalian eyes and mammalian vision systems are entirely built around understanding and perceiving our world. The reason I like this is that you have to ask yourself, where do we sit on this roadmap now? I don't think we're terribly far along, and where do we need to be? So the last thing I'm going to say, and this is a bit more speculative, I suppose. If you know anything about the Cambrian explosion, that's kind of when all complex life that we know now evolved. That's where all the fossils come from. This is where life sort of branched out in all these fantastic and interesting ways. And someone told me a really interesting theory about that, which I've taken to heart. Whether or not it's entirely accurate, I think there's a lesson to be learned from it, which is that there are these microbial mass they find under fossils that are dead from the Precambrian era. And you find these squiggles in them that are kind of parallel. And they're these soft-bodied worm-like animals that seem to be moving in a coordinated way. And that's interesting because there are very few ways you can move in a coordinated way unless you can actually sense and see. So there's a theory that what happened was these soft-bodied worm-like animals started developing rudimentary eyes. Not just photoreceptors, because you need 2 photoreceptors to get any spatial resolution. But they started to be able to see. And that's really interesting because the moment they could see, everything had to change. The moment they could see, they became predators. The moment predators came about, 2 things had to happen. Everything either had to develop their own eyes or protection from eye, which might have given birth to this whole range of interesting body shapes and shells and carapaces, as well as complicated eyes. So the point that I want you to take from that is that you change the way you do sensing, and you sense in a more efficient way, and you change the whole paradigm. Everything has to change. And I think that's a good point to end it at. So if you have any questions, I'm going to leave you with some very dramatic footage of one of our space situation awareness campaigns in South Australia. Please come visit. We'd love to have you in Australia. There's not enough international visitors who are willing to come all the way out. But we'll make it worth your while if you do. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So these are the standard, the actual focal planes are the event-based sensors, and they're the ones you can get from, there's 2 labs that produce them. They cost a few $1,000s. We take the processing of the back and put our own processing on it, but there's nothing spectacular or there's nothing exotic in the way these are standard silicon devices, and they're relatively low resolution as well. Absolutely. So if you think about infrared, for example, you only care about changes in the infrared spectrum, really. So absolutely the next step for me is looking at infrared and UV and essentially, this is getting closer to hypertemporal imaging. If you could do hyperspectral imaging at the same time and stack your sensors, well, you get the benefit of everything. So that's absolutely the direction we want to go into. It's just you're building silicon devices, so it's a bit slower. We have seen we do see some things through gaps in clouds, but it becomes extremely difficult to know exactly what you're looking at sometimes. So seeing through clouds is possible, but then of course if you move to the IR spectrum and other spectra, that falls away. You don't have to worry about it as much. But light clouds, absolutely. Heavier, denser clouds, no. So I used to say we could see through clouds, but then someone shouted at me and said, you can't see through clouds. If you can see through clouds, we'll write you a blank check. You can see through the gaps in clouds. Mm-hmm. Thank you. They didn't see it that way, though, for some reason. But yes, I actually chose the kids because, kids don't obey the rules, and they would grab things and pull things. So it has to be resilient to all of that because we can play against, anyone who's sort of cheating a little bit. Thank you.
So two questions. One, with regards to moving the camera to be able to increase ability, any thoughts or ideas about how much does that camera need to move? Is it just a little bit, or is it sweeping? And then what's the speed of that?
That's a good question. So obviously you need to move enough so that the light falling one pixel shifts to the next pixel. So there is a minimum amount you have to move, but that also depends on the optics you set up as well. In terms of speed, you can go surprisingly fast. The trick really is that you want to know your motion. So if you can measure your motion accurately, then you can go up to the speed the camera can change. So with a telescope where it's a very highly refined motor system that can move fast and accurately, that's really easy. If you're going to move it, say, a freehand camera, you're going to rely on something like an IMU, and that's going to be noisier. And the IMU's accuracy is going to probably set your accuracy more than the speed of the camera. But ultimately, you can do some interesting tricks where you use visual information from the camera combined with a noisy IMU and stabilize each other. So there are some interesting research avenues down that way.
With regard to autonomous vehicles,
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of work is being done to move towards 4K video for the fact that they want to be able to do deep learning to do small object detection, like looking for potholes in the road. That's a whole lot of data. That's a whole lot of processing. Any thoughts on applying a DVS with spiking neural networks for autonomous vehicles, either perception and or control?
So there are two startup companies that produce these cameras at the moment, and both of them are looking very actively at autonomous driving cars. Personally, I don't think it's a great application because the sensor isn't really the problem in a self-driving car. It's really how do you process the data, how do you make decisions, how do you control in this dynamic environment a vehicle. So there are definitely applications because these cameras do have high dynamic range and they are fast. And the argument says that if you have one of these cameras in a car and you're getting no data out, either you're not moving or the world's not moving, so you don't have to do anything. So the paradigm works nicely, but they're not terribly power constrained platforms. And they're not terribly fast compared to tracking low Earth orbit satellites. So the companies that exist now are looking towards higher and higher resolutions to compete with that. But I feel like there are other larger unsolved problems that in self-driving cars that aren't the sensor. It's simply about how you deal with this data. And changing the form in which you produce the data doesn't really solve the end problem, which is how do you make the car drive itself, essentially, in an intelligent way.
Hello, I loved your talk. Thank you very much. So my first question is that it's only one question, actually. So for the conventional camera, it's been out there for a while, and we know what is the meaning of a bad image. We know what is the meaning of blurred image, double image, masked image. So what is the meaning of bad image for your type of event-based cameras, and how you can attack those?
It's an excellent question. And that's actually, so I have a funded project with AFOSR to try to get to the roots of exactly that question. What the fundamentals of event-based vision. What happened here is that a bunch of excited neuroscientists and a bunch of chip designers sat together and designed these chips, but no one really stopped to go and test them properly and figure out exactly what this means, because resolution doesn't really make sense in an event-based camera because it's kind of a static term. If you can move and resolve things that are greater than your spatial resolution of your camera, that breaks down a little bit. So we have sources of noise in these cameras, and that's what constitutes a bad image. There's disfixed pattern noise, there's mismatch in the transistors, because each pixel is now doing its own thing. And that's what contributes towards a bad image. We don't have a good model for any of this. You know, they're somewhat Poisson-like in the event rate, but they couple with temperature, for example, and that's a big unsolved question. There are noisy sensors, but there are definitely ways we can make them better. And we don't have 60 years of silicon and imaging technology behind us to make it easier. So I talked primarily about sensing today, but we do a lot of work on exactly that problem. And there's two parts to it. There's student segmentation and classification. They kind of go hand in hand. And the interesting thing about a tracking problem with an event-based camera, it is almost a detection problem because it's kind of continuous. And we've got some really interesting techniques for doing exactly that. Part of the problem is that with conventional computer vision, we know what a good feature is. We kind of have an intuitive sense and an analytical sense of what a good feature is. For event-based data and the spatial temporal, I don't know what a good spatial temporal feature looks like. We came up with these biologically inspired algorithms to learn them in an unsupervised way. We do this unsupervised feature extraction where we essentially try to say, can we find a set of spatial temporal features that best describe the data we're seeing? And that's worked really well. So that plane dropping example I showed you, I can actually give a whole talk on how that system works. And that is an end-to-end classification system all done in this event-based way by trying to take things from a spatial domain and put them in a feature domain, where you're saying, like, this feature detector emits a spike. It's still event-based. But that spike says, I saw this very specific spatial temporal pattern at this very specific moment in time. And you start using time to do the encoding. And if you can use time properly, in fact, if you could build these real-time systems, you wouldn't even need to store the timestamp. You just process the events when they arrive. And you can use coincidence to avoid having to use local memory. So there's some really interesting ideas in how you process the data. But that's a whole separate subject.
One last question.
Absolutely. If someone gives me a telescope that big, I'd absolutely do it. And there's some interesting things, like, for example, someone was talking to me about using whether you can see through, say, clouds on Venus, for example, because you might be able to resolve through that moving surface. And transits as well are an enormously interesting thing because you have the speed and the dynamic range. So, I mean, yeah, there are all these exciting applications in astronomy that mirror the ones in space situational awareness. People are just more willing to fund me for the space situational awareness and less for the astronomy. But I'm very interested in all of that, and if people have ideas or telescopes and access and want to do experiments, please come find me. That's exactly what we want to do.
All right, let's thank Greg for his excellent talk.
Thank you.